Hi, my name is Helen Baker, and this is my older adult oral video presentation. After conducting my interview a few weeks back, I have decided to focus my attention on stage 5 of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. And during this stage in particular, it is the stage pertaining to adolescence and the exploration and development of identity foundations. In particular, an individual during this stage is working to define themselves as they perceive themselves in the greater context of the world around them, but also in relation to how they believe they are perceived from others as well. I interviewed a former colleague and good friend of mine for this project. She is 72 years old, has been retired for a handful of years. She was raised in a very large Catholic family. She was third in a family of 5 live births. Her birth was actually followed by twins. She describes her upbringing as growing up in poverty, due in part to her father's alcoholism and troubled employment track record. He, at sometimes throughout her childhood and adolescence, had multiple jobs, but had difficulty holding down jobs, and that defined many of her early memories of her father working. They lived across from the church they attended in rural Indiana. She did attend parish school for 8 years. She said she grew up with cousins by the dozens, having a large extended family there directly in their community, so a lot of built-in playmates. She describes growing up very close with her siblings, and still is best friends with her childhood best friend, Nancy. She recalled some pleasant and not so pleasant experiences and instances of her adolescence. She shared with me that she grew up in a very small house, even though a large family. They lived in a very small house, though it was also described to me as, particularly in her high school years, as being full with her siblings and her siblings' friends. She shared that she absolutely hated that they only had hand-me-downs. She doesn't recall her father very fondly, with the exception of one memory she shared with me that, due in large part due to her disdain for hand-me-downs, she was particularly pleased when her father, much against her mother's instructions, bought her a pink velvet dress with a stick-out slip. She also shared that she and her siblings witnessed the aftermath of her father being mugged. Upon returning from home, the mugging took place in their front yard, and the memory of him coming into the house bloodied and battered has obviously stuck with her. She also shared that one of the greatest disappointments of her adolescence was not being able to attend the Catholic high school with her friend group, due to her family not being able to afford it. So she instead had to attend the public school, and she said ultimately she acclimated to this change and made friends in the school, but that first year in particular was hard, and she credits this change and this transition and this tumultuous time for her to her weight gain in adolescence and the development of an unhealthy relationship with food. She also shared that her mother experienced a miscarriage during this time as well, though it was not something that her mother openly discussed with them as children. It was something she actually learned more about much later on in life as an adult from her aunt. She also shared that she worked early and all through high school and saved in order to help finance her education and to purchase a car that ultimately her father would loan to her older siblings whenever they needed a vehicle, even though it was in fact hers. And she bristled when she shared her feelings about how her father treated that car of hers. According to Erikson's theory, at each developmental stage, the development process actually happens as an individual addresses a challenge or a crisis, and it is in their resolution or resolving of that problem or crisis that they pass through or graduate onto the next developmental stage. Particularly in stage 5, this crisis pertains to the development of their sense of self and identity. My interviewee's identity, she shared with me, was knowingly informed by her familial, social, and cultural expectations associated with her Catholic upbringing and her gender and her placement within this family. And it was a challenge to her because she remembers having ideas about what she wanted for herself and what she wanted to do and become, and she felt, and many times during her adolescence, sort of constricted by familial and social expectations in particular. My interviewee felt very much that her gender and her social class challenged her identity formation, as she did not have the funds to follow into high school her friend group and stay within the system that she had been in her whole life. She had to ultimately to find work early to help finance college. She felt that her gender predisposed or prescribed expectations her parents had of her and for her and what she would ultimately do in her life. She was adamant, though it was interesting. She was adamant throughout our interview that she never saw any of the challenges in her lifetime as oppressive in nature. She wanted to make that very clear, that she ultimately was always aware of that her circumstances were quote unquote better than others, and that ultimately things could quote unquote always be worse. My interviewee specifically credits the challenge of wanting to attend college and knowing that there were limitations on what she felt she could do both educationally and professionally. But she does credit a good teacher of her own early on and her best friend with guiding her towards education. Her best friend, Nancy, ultimately also became a teacher as well. And they taught their first year out of college in the school they attended together. She also attributes her being able to finance the second half of her education with her father's veterans benefits. He received benefits from the federal government for being a disabled veteran, and those benefits directly helped finance the second portion of her education. I found Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory to be actually pretty helpful in looking at the greater context of my interviewee's life, but also specifically at the developmental stage of adolescence, as it's an intense and chaotic time of change and transition. I thought it was helpful to actually look at the greater context in terms of her relationship with her microsystem, specifically her family, with the cultural and religious ideas that informed how her family related to the greater world around them. Certainly, I feel that Bronfenbrenner's approach is necessarily holistic, and certainly looking at chronic stressors in her life of her father's alcoholism, and the nature of the instability associated with her father's employment and their poverty status. It's helpful to look at this through the lens of Bronfenbrenner's model for human development. Equally so, the extended network of her cousins and aunts and uncles, and the greater family, and the fact that much of her immediate community outside her family was made up of extended relatives, as well as a church community. I think it's important to acknowledge to what extent these interactions informed her adolescent development. I tend to agree with the general notions of limitations associated with Erikson's theory, particularly its dependence upon abstract ideas of human development that are difficult to quantify. In particular, I find it important to not disregard how potentially limiting it is to consider a developmental stage as restricted to a particular age group, and that these stages don't necessarily happen in abrupt, truncated, compartmentalized ways that Erikson's theory suggests. Additionally, in my readings concerning Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, I came upon some pretty convincing arguments for how gender specifically influences patterns of development, and that Little, Bakken, and Romick, for example, share that historically male development patterns have originally became synonymous with normal development patterns, and so that continued research, even though their research is from 1997, they make a strong argument for continued research into how female patterns of identity development are important, and ultimately factor in further limitations to Erikson's theory as he outlined originally. In conclusion, I find that my interviewee's developmental stage, and ultimately the crisis, the psychosocial crisis that is associated with that stage in Erikson's theory, is one that she successfully overcame. Ultimately, she is able to have a successful education, and one that led to a career that she had sought out for herself in education. Therefore, illustrating how she, even with the challenges at hand of her direct environment at both a micro and macro level, she is able to develop the sense of identity that ultimately propels her into adulthood.